So it is my pleasure today to introduce Doenja. She's a researcher and designer whose work playfully explores how everyday objects shape our relationships and experiences. Her research brings together digital textile fabrication, ecological approaches, and interaction design within the field of HCI. Playfulness truly sits at the heart of her practice, whether she's weaving, embroidering, or crafting new interactions. She often uses research through design, speculative design, and first-person methods to explore how technology, design, and human behavior intersect. She completed her PhD at SIAT in Everyday Design Studio, and she continues to collaborate with Ron and his team. She is now an assistant professor at Eindhoven University of Technology, and her projects invite reflection not only on how we design things, but also on how those things design us. And finally, I'm not sure if this is still true, but in her spare time, she enjoys snowboarding and surfing in the summer and making illustrations and taking photographs. Are those still true for you?
Well, I've moved to much flatter land, so the snowboarding and the surfing, not so much. But yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Please welcome Doenja.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm going to talk about tree bark, knots, maps, and loose ends, and how they come together in entangling practices of textiles, landscapes, and design in the field of human-computer interaction. But I want to start with an anecdote of gardening. So on a small patch, about 1 meter by 1 meter, in my parents' garden, I've been attempting to grow flax. I've been working with textiles for a few years, and I've been trying to find ways to bring the more than human trajectories of the materials and tools in closer proximity to me. And when I started this little patch, I knew the chances of harvesting enough yarn to produce anything were small. I'm not a great gardener. I have never grown flax before, and even if successful, the amount of flax that I sewed here would be enough only to weave a small napkin. Yet going through these steps, sewing the flax in rows, weeding the area, and creating a net to support the plants, I could feel a kinship with this material growing. But I also felt a tension. Could this be about something else than harvesting and becoming material? Just as these plants were starting to produce little blue flowers that you see in the middle here, its buds turning brown means it's harvesting time. This question that I had, this tension, was made obsolete by a heavy summer storm that in one evening blew away my bamboo stick net structure and cracked the stems of the flax. How do landscapes, materials, and histories participate in design? How can design research embrace uncertainty and entanglement? And how do more than human actors like trees, materials, and environments shape our design practices? Before I dive into these topics, I want to acknowledge that much of the thinking I'll share today was developed while I lived and studied as a settler on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in what is now known as Vancouver, where many of you are joining from. These lands and waters have been deeply shaped by colonial infrastructures, logging, railways, and ports that continue to alter more than human relations. During my time there as a PhD student and settler, I learned that Indigenous philosophies and practices have long held important perspectives for cohabitating in shared worlds, foregrounding relations, reciprocity, and responsibilities beyond human exceptionalism. These ideas continue to influence my work and thinking, especially as I reflect on design's entanglements with land, materials, and non-human worlds. So today I am joining you, like I said, from a much flatter land, actually from below sea level, from the Netherlands, a landscape profoundly shaped by centuries of land reclamation, water management, and colonial thinking. The dikes, polders, and canals that define this place are the result of ongoing efforts to control and contain natural forces, reflected in a worldview rooted in mastery over land, water, and more than human life. These practices are entangled with Dutch histories, where similar logics of extraction and control were extended overseas. This shapes not only the land beneath my feet, but also how design, nature, and technology are imagined here, often through separation rather than relation. So as I share my work today, I reflect on how these histories inform our approaches to design, and especially to design in more than human worlds. What does it mean to come to design from these ecologies? I want to start with grounding this talk in the context that many of us are already grappling with, the Anthropocene, a time where human activity has become a planetary force, reshaping landscapes, climates, ecologies, and entire species relations. For design, this raises urgent questions. How have we designed ourselves into this mess? And more importantly, how might we design differently in ways that cultivate relations with the land, materials, and more than human worlds rather than extract from them? This is where I draw from post-humanist and more than human theories, scholars like Haraway, Tsing, Braidotti, and many others, who remind us that humans have never acted alone and that we live on a shared planet with many other species. And in the field of human-computer interaction, these ideas becoming increasingly influential, inviting us to rethink design not just as something that we do for humans, but with the messy, entangled ecologies that we're part of. At the heart of this shift is a change in perspective from seeing the human at top of some imagined hierarchy to seeing ourselves within a network of relations. More than human thinking is relational. It decenters the human and asks us to attend to porous, interconnected boundaries, to recognize that plants, materials, the weather, and even the infrastructures we design participate, shaping us as much as we shape them. And crucially, it means that recognizing that we too are more than human. Our bodies, our tools, our environments are all porous and entangled. This raises a personal question, one that I'm still working through. What kind of designer does this require? And what kind of designer am I becoming? So in my work, I explore these ideas through making, through design projects that help me think with materials, with landscapes, and with non-human actors. And today I'll share how weaving, knitting, growing, shrinking, walking have become ways to surface these more than human entanglements. I'm going to start with a project that I'm working on together with my grandfather, even though he has long passed, and sometimes with my mom, who's still here and who I think is also joining online today. So hi, Mom. I moved back to the Netherlands, the country where I was born, in September 2022, after having lived in Vancouver for 6 years. And I found myself in a strange place. So the streets that I had known well had changed. Houses had been renovated, shops had disappeared, people had passed through and moved on. And while I had visited my hometown of Amsterdam during my years away, returning to live here made me feel ungrounded, disconnected, and sometimes disoriented. I went through some old stuff, boxes of things that had been stored in my parents' house, and I found my grandfather's herbarium that you see pictured here. It's a collection of plant specimens annotated with information of the species and finding location, and it dates back to 1933 when he worked on it for a school assignment. He was 17. As soon as I held it in my hands, these childhood feelings of being captivated by this book rushed back to me. Thick yellowed pages filled with delicately pressed and slightly faded flowers and leaves, separated by thinner sheets of overlay paper, careful handwriting throughout. This is my grandfather and my grandmother a long time ago. And this is my grandfather, my grandmother, and me also a long time ago. And since this serendipitous encounter, I have been revisiting where my grandfather collected the specimen to create my own herbarium of more than human encounters in Amsterdam. His entries from decades ago have become my instructions, and through this, I have met poppies, Vigalia flowers, trees, shrubs, and have become more attuned to the ways that these species temporally exist in my city. My grandfather's herbarium contains over 50 samples, including leaves of trees, like elms, alders, poplars, willows, bushes and shrubs, like acacia, blindweed, rhododendron, but also grasses and flowers like poppies, dandelion, white clover, Vigalia, and forget-me-nots. It's not a good herbarium. By that I mean it is not scientifically useful due to a lack of details and precision and completeness. So the place notations and the labels, as I came to realize when I was working with it, are sometimes scarce or vague. A lot of information is missing or crossed out. And the collected plants are missing important parts like the root system or flowers, and they've become damaged. However, this uncertainty and these open points provided me with an opportunity to engage differently with the flora, with the trees, and my own positionality in a city. In a way, it allowed me to time travel, to follow threads from the past to the present and back in nonlinear ways, as I will show. When I decided to create my herbarium, I thought it would be quite straightforward. I went to an office supply store, bought a large notebook, and set out to follow the steps from my grandfather's herbarium. Collect plant, tape plant to page, note the location and date. Sometimes it does go like this. I pick up his book and I browse through the pages. Simultaneously, I open my book, which still has many empty pages. I look for one that corresponds roughly with the date or season. And once I have selected a sample from his book, I go on a walk and try to find the plant. I'm starting to get better at recognizing and distinguishing different species, but sometimes I still use assistance from plant recognition apps. I collect the material to bring back home, where I arrange it between tissue paper and weigh it down. I leave it like this for a few days before I take the dried leaves inside to put in my book and annotate with the details. But usually the process goes more like this. I pick up his book, I pick up my book. It is not at all the right season, but I want to proceed anyways. His instructions are vague, things are crossed out, the city has changed, that park no longer exists. I look for an entry that speaks to me, and I can't always articulate why. I go out, I encounter lots of more than human life, but I don't always find the plant I'm looking for. And when I do, it doesn't feel right to take a piece of it home with me to stick on a page. Who am I to uproot it from its habitat? I also wonder what other elements of my encounter are left off the page. And so my pages have become increasingly explorative and fabulative, including materials beyond the plant species and notations that become questions, prose, or poem, rather than precise annotations. I continuously question my practices around the herbarium as I work with it, and I have found the questions and tensions that arise from the process helpful in navigating my more than human design practice. I want to talk today about one of the walks, this walk that I decided to go on in the area of Admiralengracht, which is one of the canals in Amsterdam, to look for elms that my grandfather had seen there. So on this page, he wrote down young elms, around 2 years old. This is the Admiralengracht. As you can see, it is lined with trees. And on several occasions, I was convinced that I had found an elm, eagerly picking up more leaves from the ground. Each time I pulled out my phone and opened the plant recognition app, and each time, alas, plenty of linden trees, various kinds of elder trees, willows, poplars, and maples too. As I circled around the canal, I felt a sadness coming on. There were only a handful of trees left, and every single one of them was an elder. Elm, elm, elm. I started cheering on the app as I was scanning for results when I double, triple, quadruple checked for yet another elder leaf. I gave up and walked back home. I felt dissatisfied not having found an elm. And then suddenly I saw them on my way back to the canal close to my house, where I must have walked a million times before, full of elms. I gratefully collected the leaves and reflected on the irony of going on a walk far away, only to find elms close to my house. I later found out that the elms on Admiralengracht had been cut due to elms disease, an extremely virulent species spread by beetles that devastated elms in Europe and North America in the 1940s. I took the leaf and put it on the page in my herbarium, and I wrote down Admiralengracht, crossed it out, and instead wrote Lauriergracht. I also wrote the following. I hold in my hand a linden leaf, then an alder, willow, poplar, and maple. No elms. I was promised elms. I look at my grandfather as he walks along the Admiralengracht, before he met me, before he met my mother or my grandmother. I tell him, that elm won't be there much longer. He puts the leaf in his pocket, and later on, back at home, the address that is stamped on the cover page of the herbarium, he writes, "Young elms." I hold my much smaller hand in his, my other in my grandmother's, as I glide down a slide. "I know now," he says, "elm's disease." "Yes," I say, "but there are young elms near our place now, at the Lauriergracht," and we walk over together. This conversation, of course, never took place, not in real time, but the encounters with the lack of elms revealed a non-chronological experience of the city of Amsterdam. In the text, these first lines are in the time of the encounter at the Admiralengracht. I then picture my grandfather in the past, back in the time that he was collecting the elm leaf, before I was born and before he had even met my grandmother. And then I tell him about the threat of elm's disease that I learned about when trying to figure out what happened to the elms at the Admiralengracht. Then I jump in time, imagine myself as a child going down a slide, and at this point, my grandfather also lived through the times of elm disease and therefore is in the know. Then in the final sentences, we arrive back in the present time where we have both come to an understanding of the elms in the city. So this project, of course, is and might seem like only a personal story about plants and memory, but for me, it speaks to the practices that we can carry into design, especially when working with more than human relations. First, there is something really powerful in starting small, in generous noticing from humble beginnings. A forgotten herbarium, a vague annotation, a single leaf can become an opening for attending differently. And it reminds us that even when flawed or incomplete archives can hold potential for re-encountering the world. Second, walking with the possibility of getting lost became quite central. My search for the elms took me in circles, misidentifications, failed app scans, dead ends. But getting lost opened space for new ways of seeing, of noticing what I wasn't looking for, and of being surprised by what was nearby all along. Finally, these works invite us to fabulate with time, to resist design's tendency towards futures or permanence or linear progress. In weaving past, present together, the herbarium becomes less about fixing knowledge and more about holding space for uncertainty, disappearance, revisiting, and ongoing relations. These are approaches that I hope resonate with you as an invitation to design, not only with what is present, but also with what is lost, overlooked, or not yet known. And this project is also an example of how I became aware of my entanglements with trees, which led into the next project called Knitting with Unknown Trees, in which we're knitting with trees, with this amazing group of people on the page here. So this project is also situated in the city of Amsterdam. And Amsterdam is built on swampy ground and has a long history with trees. In the 16th century, elms were systematically planted to strengthen the canal banks and to act as biological pumps. And to this day, despite elm's disease, elms are still overwhelmingly in the majority amongst tree species in Amsterdam. Trees in cities can fulfill important roles. They can improve air quality, regulate temperature, manage stormwater, and offset emissions. They also provide habitats for various non-humans like birds, insects, and fungi. And they've also been linked to mental health benefits like reduced stress, better mood, improved cognitive function. But if we think about trees, the perspective of trees, they tend to flourish better in forest environments that can provide rich soil and biodiverse environments. And trees really experience a lot of stresses in urban environments, like damages from construction or vibrations from traffic, pollution, limited space for their mycorrhizal networks to grow. So cities are not natural habitats for trees and require a lot of planning. For example, in Amsterdam, there's a lot of city planning going into the spacing of trees so that they're evenly spaced and have enough parking spots in between. They're monitored for the risk of falling down, for example, as they can pose risks for passersby. And this is a special ginkgo. It's labeled special in the middle of Amsterdam, which is protected by a cage to protect its bark. Sometimes there's elaborate operations to move trees when there is construction happening. And this might be one of my favorite tree stories from Amsterdam. This is an elm that during a storm had fallen down into the water and then became a water elm as it continued growing across the canal. It had to be cut because of a disease, and under protest of nearby citizens, The city then replanted trees to continue to grow as water elms to replace the lost water elm. So cities and trees are a clear example of nature culture, a concept that recognizes nature and culture as inseparable and mutually shaping, challenging the idea that nature is separate from humans or from design or from politics and technology. Like many cities worldwide, the city of Amsterdam hosts an online map of trees that are managed by the municipality, 260,000 registered trees overall. They host the geolocations of these trees, organized by the top 15 most common species. As you can see, the elm is right up there, Ulmus. Accompanied with, if you click on one of these data points, information pops up, including identification number, type of species, height, planting year. And this map and the data are used mostly for maintenance and city planning, keeping track of diseases, planning the cutting of low-hanging branches that may disturb traffic, and negotiating which trees need to be moved or planted. Vancouver actually also has a map like this if you're interested in checking it out. But in many ways, these type of mappings are always behind the trees as they produce seedlings, grow, decay, break, or fall in storms. Trees are continuously unmaking the data set. We grew interested in these aspects that sometimes literally fall outside of the map and sought alternative ways to relate to and design with the data. Within this data set, there are around 2,600 labeled and geotagged entries as unknown, onbekende soorten, that you see down here. A tree might be unknown for various reasons, including human error or bureaucratic complexities of maintaining data sets, or simply because it has fallen down. And the aim of this project was not necessarily to fix the unknowns or to fill in the blanks or to understand the reasons why, but rather we see this unknown tree category as an opportunity for alternative ways of engaging with the data set, one that might point to alternative ways of knowing city trees. So in this project, we ask, how could we design with the data to reveal other human and non-human relations with city trees? To do this, we are knitting. We're knitting a counter archive of these unknown trees. Why knitting, you might ask? We were trying to see craft as a way of engaging with this missing data, and we felt it would help us to resist narratives of use and efficiency and be sort of a tactile response to the erasure of these trees. But to start knitting this counter archive, we needed to craft our practice or assemble a practice of tree knitters. And to practice also means to try out, to stumble, to regret, and to learn. So what I'll present on the next pages are snippets or fragments of our ongoing project in which we are knitting with the tree data. Our main commitment here is to enable participation of the trees, as well as other non-humans, not only in the outcome, but throughout the design process. And so our process roughly looks like this. We start with the tree data. We then work with tree bark to translate into knitting data, as well as any other non-humans that we might encounter in the assemblage. And finally, we knit. So I'm going to talk to you through the steps and sort of our process of how we came to understand our practice in these separate things. So first, to enable encounters with these unknown trees, we worked with the tree map and its data with the intention to shift away from a human-centered top-down view. I first imported the data set into my Google Maps application to make it easier to locate and get acquainted with these unknown trees. So these green trees that you see here are all unknown trees. And I encountered multiple unknown trees, either through plant walks, as well as through serendipitous encounters. For example, if I was running errands or if I was in unfamiliar neighborhoods, I would pull up this app and see if there were any unknown trees nearby. And sometimes I found a tree, and other times I found a pole, a patch, or a stump where I was expecting a tree. But importing this map into the Google Maps application enabled me to become attuned to these city trees in my day-to-day life. And over time, I became familiar with some of the trees and started relating to them for navigation through the city. So I would plan out my bike route and think, oh yeah, take a left at that tree. This became important in informing the walks that we then went on as a group, so with all the tree knitters. In creating these walks, we drew from the online data set and looked at aspects like tree height, species information, as well as any contextual clues like water or parks or playgrounds to create tree-centric routes that intentionally avoided familiar navigation cues like street names or right or left. For example, instead of saying, take a left at the next street, the instructions would read, don't go towards the water, go into this side of the street. Or to count 17 Platanus hispanica, which meant adjusting our walking pace to the spacing between trees. Our walking activities invited creative reinterpretation of the city tree maps, which was originally designed for maintenance and planning, but we kept using the same sort of data information. And the tree map of the city enabled us to find these unknown trees. But through these examples, we've also shown that the map can generate relations of personal navigation and attunement. And what was really important for us was a shift from locating to disorienting with trees. As you can imagine, with these instructions, we also often got lost. But this was important in our practice in that it invited not only the unknown tree, but also its relations to other more than human elements in its surroundings. The second step is focused on the tree bark. So to be able to knit with the trees, we sought to collect data that could be translated and imported into the knitting software. We explored several tools and approaches within which we paid attention to how they allowed for non-human agencies to come forward. We started with 3D scanning based on existing expertise in our team of translating scans to knit, focused on human bodies. And also 3D scanning technologies are prevalent in both tree and knitting practices. But to scan a full tree, one needs a largely free, accessible circumference area, which is usually not the case in a city, where a busy road or cars or buildings can get in the way. And in the right corner here, you see that it actually also captured Oogjes' face. So we decided to focus on capturing only part of the tree's bark, but it remained really challenging to capture the granularity of texture that we were looking for to translate into knits. We also explored panorama photos of tree bark using our phone camera, and this technique allowed us to capture not only the tree bark texture, but also various colors as well as lichen and moss. And this emerging rectangular panoramic shape also resonated with the shape of the knit bed from the machine that we were working with. Something that we encountered during our bark experiments was an assumption that we had of tree bark, which, unlike categorizable aspects of trees that you might use to recognize them, like the shape of the leaves or flowers, fruits, and even winter buds, bark textures keep evolving as trees mature, and differences in species are often really nuanced and subtle. So consequently, our focus shifted from looking up species as they were represented in the data set to instead focus on textures of bark as they were expressed across species, but also even within individual trees. So eventually we turned to a technique of bark rubbings, which is a process of pressing paper onto the bark and using crayons to capture its texture. And the resulting data is a binary map of texture points, which really translated quite seamlessly into our knitting software. And unlike the 3D scans or the panoramic images, this also allowed for a more intimate and embodied engagement with the tree's surface. We could touch and feel the texture through the paper and pigment. It also allowed us to make careful, situated decisions like choosing where to rub and annotating the presence of other species alongside the bark's unique features. We also engaged in noticing exercises to understand the polyphonic assemblages and other more than human life around these unknown trees. So we carried handouts with prompts, clay, cyanotype, sketching paper, and string. And through this, we encountered things like ants, climbing plants, lichen, moss, bike locks, curious citizens, dogs, cigarette butts, construction material, ducks, and undoubtedly a lot more that we were not aware of in the moment. Here are some examples and some of the notes we tried to take of these other things we encountered. Especially having these tools like clay and cyanotype that take time to develop really enabled us to spend more time with the trees as we were sitting with them. And this is one of my favorite reflections from Netta, who traced the path of an ant crawling over the ridges and furrows, which provided once again a different perspective of the bark as shelter or as a pathway or as a foraging ground. This act of closely following and tracing their journey momentarily shifted our human-centric view, prompting us to consider how non-humans relate to the tree. And so these rituals of observation and pausing have become really integral to our practice to keep creating space for multi-species perspectives. So we kind of have this mantra now in our team meetings where we say, keep following the ants. So finally, the tree knits. So knitting with trees meant that we were translating tree data to knit data. And to understand the different ways of doing this, we explored different machines and eventually broadened our focus from bark to also include other textures. Our knitting sessions began with a Shimaseki machine. This was chosen for its capability to knit tubular shapes, again, usually for humans. So if you look at a sweater, it's 3 tubes following the tubes of a human body. But this also resonated with the natural form of trees, which are essentially a collection of tubes formed by stems and branches. So we started with simple knitting patterns creating that translated the bark texture with knit and purl stitches that you see here. But we soon felt that this was not sufficient in characterizing the nature of these unknown trees. So these are some sketches of different bark texture as they translate to knitting texture. And this was really interesting in that we started to shift and kind of start looking at the bark relations through knitting language, if that makes sense. We expanded our knitting sessions and started working on the knitterate as well as manual flatbed machines to explore design features like gaps for lichen growth or pathways for ants to traverse or loose threads and floats for climbing plants to hook onto. It soon became clear that there were endless possibilities, and we are now opening the invitation even further. So we're focusing on knitting packages and instructional files that can also allow others to knit. So as you can see here, we're developing flexible knit packages, which in knit programming, a package is kind of the smallest unit of a pattern that contains of stitch and operational information, and are used in combination of color-coded work areas. And we're focusing on libraries of packages that can translate data into layered knit structures to reflect different information that we've collected, whether it's height, color, texture, or multi-species interaction. These can then be flexibly and iteratively combined to create different samples. And what we're working towards now is to open our knitted counter archive up through different workshops, but also through anyone else who can knit and would like to knit a tree. So if you are a knitter and if you're interested, please sign up and contribute to our counter archive. It might take us a little while, but we would love to send you some instructions to find an unknown tree near you and to knit a sample as well. So this project became less about trees or data alone and more about what happens when we approach materials, tools, and knowledge with generosity and care. So first, generosity in materials and tools. We chose knitting, something tactile, flexible, and open-ended, which allowed space for expressing uncertainty, absence, and failure. The yarn didn't demand precision or correctness the way that the dataset did. Instead, it invited to interpret, adapt, and create their own responses to what was missing or unknown. And this became important in our process to choose tools that expand rather than to narrow possibilities. Think also about the cyanotype or the clay that we took on our walks. Second, this project was about resisting dominant trajectories. The way that the city data tidies nature into categories erases what doesn't fit or renders trees simply as points on a map. By knitting with the unknown trees, we made visible what was absent, incomplete, or erased, and resisted the urge to fix it. Finally, the work was a practice of keeping space for the not yet, for what might emerge when we stop trying to resolve uncertainty. By staying with the unknown trees and with the ants, for example, the project became not about solving, but about holding space for tensions, for questions, and for other ways of relating to urban nature. What I want to share next isn't really a single project, but more of an approach, a way of noticing something that's been happening across my work and in the work of others as well. So earlier, I opened this talk with the example of growing flax, a project that was shaped as much by sort of the slow seasonal rhythms of the plants as by any design intention. And that experience really stayed with me, not just as a project, but as a way of working that I've come to think of as backyard practices, not always confined to backyards, but grounded in that sensibility to design alongside more than human worlds that are already somewhat familiar to you. So we started using this term, backyard practices, to talk about those familiar spaces where design involves within the messiness of everyday multi-species life. Here's a glimpse of my current backyard, which is a balcony. It's right in front of me, but it's dark out here now, so I can't show you. And I've moved quite often, but these spaces, backyards and balconies, have shaped how I think about design as something already entangled with what's happening around me. And this is the paper that's coming out at CHI 2025, also together with Ron, where we reflect on this approach, on what it means to design in ways that resist control or resolution, and instead to stay with the processes that shift, decay, and grow. One example is my ongoing shrinking textiles experiment, which are textiles that are placed outside, exposed to the rain, the sun, the weather, and other elements, and they're slowly shrinking over time. So these textiles are woven with a cornstarch-based dissolvable yarn, which in hot water would dissolve completely, but in cold water it becomes kind of gooey, sticky, and it shrinks. And so then it pulls the other yarns that are woven within it, creating this sort of ripple effect. I was really curious what this material would do in an outside environment. Would it invite non-human interaction? Would insects come to eat the cornstarch? Would plant intersect with it? What would the weather do? Or might it extend my own senses and help me notice things like humidity differently? So I place these textiles in the gardens and balconies of places that I move through. My friend's balcony that you see on the left here, I sometimes house sit for them and look after their bunnies. My parents' garden, which is on the right here. And then this is my my balcony of a place I lived in Rotterdam that I've since moved away from. But last summer, I was taking care of my parents' house and garden. Again, I'm not a good gardener, so it became kind of a jungle. But I placed 3 shrinking textiles in their yard, and every time I would go out into the garden to take care of it, or to hang my laundry, or to chat with my neighbor, to read a book, to get something out of storage, etc., I would have a brief encounter with the textiles. And in the beginning, I could easily notice the shrinkage, for example, after a night of heavy rain. But later on, these changes were more subtle. Colors started fading. There were maybe slugs traveling across the textiles or pollen collected on the fibers. And when I visited my friend's balcony or returned to my own place, I'd also see the textiles again. So these traces of time passing, changes I might have missed if I wasn't watching slowly, really this allowed me to see these incremental effects or these subtle changes. So I don't really have an answer yet to the questions of participation or noticing that I started this experiment with, but the backyard did offer me sort of a safe space or a safe place to ask these questions, a small version of an ecology that I'm already somewhat familiar with. And of course, this way of working connects back to the other projects that I've shared, tracing plants through my grandfather's herbarium or knitting with unknown trees in Amsterdam. In each of these, I found myself moving through the city, walking streets that I know well but have changed, and encountering them differently. Slowly, the city began to feel like an extended backyard, a space I was already part of, but could also attend to with the same care, slowness, and curiosity. Like backyards, these urban spaces are layered with histories, absences, growth, and trees I didn't know, plants out of place, materials breaking down. Each encounter became part of the same question. What does it mean to design not as an outsider, but as someone already entangled in these more than human worlds? What these backyard practices teach us, and we go more into this in the paper, is less about what we design and more about how we stay with our design practice, how we reorient ourselves to design in more than human worlds. First, they invite us to practice decentering, to repeatedly train ourselves to feel what it means to become part of something larger, messy, and unpredictable, like tending to the garden or sitting with materials as they shrink, fail, rot. It's about letting go of control and certainty. Second, they ask us to consistently engage with non-humans as participants, not just to notice plants, the weather, insects, but to actively let their timings, their needs, their responses shape our process. The projects were often determined by blooming cycles, rainfall, or the slow decay of materials, and really to design with this, not for. Thirdly, these backyards create spaces where it's possible and necessary to act without knowing and with humility. They hold the discomfort of not having clear answers, allowing partial knowledge and failure to become part of the work rather than something to fix. Fourth, backyard practices opens possibilities for queerly designing alongside. And by that, I mean reordering what counts as important, letting mundane moments like watering plants, hanging laundry, noticing a spider, having a cup of coffee, shift our sense of what it means to design. And finally, we learn to be affected. Backyard practices foregrounds the timing of pollination, the resilience of fragility of a summer storm, and in doing so allows these more than human worlds to change how we think, feel, and act as designers. I want to end with 3 summarizing points. One is to see design as a more than human practice. And when I say more than human practice, I mean it's something that we do and keep doing. So practicing means knowing we won't get it right the first time. It means stumbling. It means changing course. It means learning as we go. It's not about reaching a goal or finishing the work. It's about staying with the work, staying open, staying responsive to the more than human worlds we're part of. The second is that to understand shared space, we need different ways of articulating time. Shared space is always layered with different beings and different rhythms. To design in these spaces, we need to think of time as impermanent, nonlinear, and deeply historical. It's not just about futures, but about cycles, disappearances, and emergences, about staying with processes of becoming rather than fixing outcomes. And finally, certainty places us in a paradigm of domination, whereas uncertainty can enable participation. Certainty is really seductive in design. It promises control, clear outcomes, and solutions, but it often locks us into a paradigm where we dominate the world around us, shaping it according to what we know and what we expect. If we prioritize uncertainty, something shifts. Acting with not knowing creates room for others, especially non-human others, to participate in ways we couldn't have predicted. Uncertainty asks us to slow down, to resist filling every gap with our own assumption, to stay curious. It lets materials speak back, lets landscapes change the plan, lets species we hadn't noticed shape the process. And maybe that's where more than human design really begins. Not in certainty or control, but in choosing to stay with uncertainty long enough to see who else or what else might participate. So thank you, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have. Um, I can't hear anything. I don't know if anything's being said or asked.
Okay, it's the other window.
Yes.
I don't see in front of you. I get it. Okay. Okay, great. Can you hear the room now?
Yes, again. Yes.
Fantastic. So people in the Zoom room, I think you should be able to, at this point, ask questions in the chat. Okay, why don't we start with questions from the room? I'm really sorry, but honestly, I just found out that Sam is ill, and I have not done a webinar like this before, so I have no idea how to get people to do it. But maybe I could always call IT. But let's just start with some questions from the room. By the way, Doenja, that was really moving
Oh,
and really full of such connection with our material being, and even like I was just so captivated by it. So thank you so much. And the beautiful relationship between the materiality of the trees, the history, the actual physical nature, and then the data into the knitting. It's just so threaded.
well, thank you. I'm really glad it resonated. That's lovely to hear.
So let's just maybe start with the room, and in the meantime, I will see, I don't see any questions. Oh, maybe the chat is underneath that, like what, there's, hang on a sec,
I can see the chat, so, but I don't think there's any questions yet, but if they pop up, I can also read them out if that's easier.
oh, great, great, okay, so, does somebody in the room want to go, or I can, this one just popped up, so maybe I'll start with this, that's a good idea. So anonymous attendee says, great talk, very interesting thoughts. I am new to this domain. I wonder if it is possible to apply these design approaches to work or professional tasks, for example, data analysis, writing. If so, do you have any suggestions? So
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I think it's possible. I think if anything from this talk, you'll see that I'm quite uh, generous in trying things. But I will say that I do think it requires to work with more than human theory and thinking. It's quite a big shift in thinking, and it takes time. So I don't think there's any sort of quick fixes to do that. I think it takes time to kind of sit with what it means to shift from sort of a human-centric view and all the methods that come with that, and sort of are really deep assumptions that are in those methods. So I absolutely think it's possible, but I think it takes a minute. I think maybe another interesting starting point is to find something like a herbarium, or other researchers have engaged in things like bird watching, for example, or even gardening, and allow that to kind of guide your thinking, where you're not as connected to maybe the goals or the requirements you have of your work, and you're a little bit more free to reflect on those shifting relationships, and then just give it some time for it to come together. So I think it's lovely to try, but I would maybe start with something less connected to it at first.
okay, thanks. So now I see that there's a webinar. The chat is separate from this question and answer part. So I will. So Shannon, I found your chat. So is somebody in the room? Is somebody in the room like to ask a question?
I have a question.
What's it? Okay, go
Hi.
Lisa.
Thank you. That was really wonderful to almost, of course, I'm familiar with Ron's work and your work, but it's been really lovely to hear where you're at now and where it's all progressing to. I have two questions. One is connected to the elm trees and
Mhm.
this idea of thinking about the more than human and the disease and the beetles. And like, of course, this is kind of complicated moment of what that might mean. And you have this personal connection with it, but of course the beetle and the disease is having its own encounter.
Mhm.
So I'm curious what your thoughts were on that. And then the other piece was, I'm more of a knitter than a weaver. I know that you started more in the weaving space and perhaps into knitting. And like the metaphor, even just in the form itself, carries so much. How it can be disassembled, reassembled, the structure. There's
Mhm.
so much between those two different forms of textile creation. And I'm wondering
Mhm.
how shifting to knitting has kind of maybe shifted your own thoughts and practice, like how that textile transition has moved you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really great questions to respond to. I'll start with the first one about the elm trees and elm's disease. Um, I honestly, I didn't spend too much time diving into it. I just was really curious what happened to those elms on the Admiralengracht. And that's how I found out about, I knew about Elm's disease. It's actually called Dutch Elm's disease because it really took over in the Netherlands, but it has traveled everywhere since. I think it shows, really complicated relationships of what we prioritize. It's absolutely the elms over the beetles, right? But also that to engage with non-humans is not necessarily virtuous. It's not always, for good. Uh, Non-humans can also be very destructive. Yeah, so I think there's layers to that. I'm curious if there's more in your question that you're getting at. So curious to discuss.
Yeah, do you want me to?
Um,
Well, maybe
yeah, sure, sure.
I don't want it's this thing of like our relationship with certain non-humans are pests. And
Yeah,
why are they pests? Because they're pests to us, or they're pests to our economy, or they're pests to our aesthetic. And so there's
yeah,
this whole other politic that's happening every time that's underneath everything when we decide those things. So maybe that's a
yeah.
different conversation we can have.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. And I think in this case, it becomes really clear that obviously the elms were integral to the city of Amsterdam. So to not prioritize the elms would have meant a collapse of all the houses that are already tilted and leaning on each other. And, so I think it was, but yeah, I think that's where some of this also gets quite political. And it's not just, it's not just the non-humans, right? But yeah, I think that's really interesting. The other question about knitting versus weaving. Yes, so I even wouldn't call myself a weaver quite yet either, but I started working with textiles as part of my research kind of towards the end of my PhD. And I did start weaving at that point on the TC2 Jacquard loom, which was really um, uh, a way in for me because I knew Photoshop and that kind of allowed me to start weaving. Um, and I've written about how that allowed me to see or articulate design as a more than human practice too. And a big part of that was because I didn't know how to weave. I was kind of new to these spaces and I asked really silly questions and I could see the space kind of anew. Um, but also weaving has like such a long, like I weave once a month maybe, if that. And weaving has a really long history. So I still don't know if I feel certain, like fully qualified to call myself a weaver. But I did start to know the space a little bit more. And I think it was actually important to me to dive into another practice where I also could kind of be an idiot. So that's where I shifted to knitting as well. And I am definitely not a knitter yet. So there's amazing knitters on that team. Jasmijn Vugts, Xiang Lin, Ash, Troy. And they've been doing a lot of this translating. And I think this is really important to be able to start constructing like this different type of language and to keep asking those questions. And that's where I think the productive thing is happening between understanding bark through a knitting lens. Um, But yeah, then some of the qualities you're talking about the knit being like one long yarn. We also chose knitting because at the beginning we thought we would put these textiles back on the tree, and then knit has some stretch to it, so it would allow to grow with the tree. I don't think we want to do that anymore. But that's where some of that decision making was coming from. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you're a knitter, then please knit a sample with us. That would be so fun.
I guess there is a question from Shannon, which is about how to get involved in the knitting. Do I just email?
Yes, just email. Again, it might take us a minute, but what we'd love to do is kind of grow an archive that is dispersed over all different places that have these maps of trees. So yeah, email, and then we will send you instructions. So you can either email me or that email address that was in the slides. I can also share that later again.
Yeah, maybe this is a time that Doenja, I can maybe share it with you as well as graduate students at large, is that we are going to focus on knitting in part in room 33. No, room 3350, is that the number?
That's
We haven't named it. Have we named it? Ron
Room
Lamb is
3350.
named. Yeah. So
Right.
that's a really exciting from the perspective of exploration and material exploration. I just wanted to put that out there. It is really exciting. So let's see. There is a question about HCI, and that Chris Hand was interested to see HCI in the title of your paper with Ron, appearing at Kai, and maybe want some clarification about the implications for HCI and what you've been talking about. That's a big question. And in general, your view, how is the more than human turn affecting research through design in HCI?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want
Yeah,
to?
sure. Yeah, thanks. And really nice to see someone joining from Scotland. Yeah, so my work is definitely situated in HCI. So all of the work I do is framed within that. But that being said, this more than human design work is happening in many other areas as well. But I think especially some of the things around temporality that I've been talking about are really implications for HCI. So to not only keep well, one thing is about sort of the future orientation, where we talk about futures in kind of a disconnected way as though they have no pasts or they have no presents. Whereas in the past and presents are a lot of assumptions that are that end up in those futures that we're imagining. Uh, and to engage more with history. So that is one thing. But the other thing is also the pace of HCI and development of design that we do within that. So a lot of sort of quick iterations or fail fast and fail often. And so the speed at which we're developing things, I think, is really challenged when we when we come at it from a more than human perspective, to also think about timescales that are not human. And then your question about how the more than human turn is affecting research through design in HCI. Yeah, I think research through design, at least the way that I'm using it, is just a really interesting way to ask some of these questions. Because especially with the knitting project, when you're asking these questions in material form, you're already kind of getting at a not fully human language. There might still be quite a lot of human-centric assumptions in the way that you're going about things, but you're already speaking in material dialogues and machine dialogues, which in my experience gets you a little closer to more than human dialogues. So that is what I think is really interesting about it. How it's affecting research through design as a whole in HCI, though, that's a big question.
Can I ask the question? Do you want to ask the question for? I just have a question just about this question about
Yeah.
question, just as a brief one, which is I really kind of clicked when you talked about the relationship of temporality and alternative temporalities. And I guess, I mean, I'm not sure how to phrase the question, but I'll phrase it one way, that is to say, like, when, you know, what have you noticed is found or revealed in paying attention to the temporality and this and the potential spaciousness of it, like the you know, opening of it, as opposed to what we do typically, where we do things fast, we, you know, we are, and what could be, I'm just really curious about, in the work you've done, what noticing has occurred in the space of reconsidering temporalities. Because I think when we're looking at more than human, we have these multiple, huge, multiple diverse temporalities, from the infinite to the, well, from infinite both ways. So yeah, I just because that's one of the things I really noticed, is some of the, what, you know, what you could see or what you could feel, what came, what not kind of knowledge or insight or whatever you want to call it, emerged from just the practices. Can you talk just a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. That's a lovely way of phrasing the question, so thank you. Yeah, I think mostly just a richness and a multiplicity of relations that becomes possible if you broaden temporality even by a bit, right? So instead of looking at maybe a snippet in time, or you know, I think most of HEI has moved past this already, but this framing of using technology and only looking at use, and kind of broadening that by a lot. There's just with every minute you broaden it by, there's more relations that you can take into account. And then what you were saying that I thought was really poignant about how, I mean, time and space are so connected and related. So by extending the time that you have with something, I think it also becomes clear how it's connected to many different spaces. And yeah, the point I was making around shared space and how we understand shared space, I think that only becomes apparent through multiple encounters or rhythms, or even dissonances, things where moments clash. Or when I was talking about the herbarium and it wouldn't be the right time to go out, for example, just getting attuned to different seasons as well. And so I think part of it is in how we articulate these things too. So I wrote a short paper together with Audrey Desjardins, who's also a SIAT alum, which was framed within research through design. So maybe I'm circling back a little bit to your question, Chris. That was really about finding more nuance in the terms we use when we talk about the processes of design. But also just more nuance in how we talk about time. So we proposed some terms like moments, encounters, transitions, also dissonances, to give some scaffolds to use them basically as lenses to see what relations are revealed when we think about certain events as a transition versus when we think about them as a moment. So yeah, sorry, that's a really long-winded way of speaking about your question there, Tekla, but I hope it was getting at some of what you were asking.
I don't know, for some reason I love the word snippet, because
Snippet, yeah, snippet or fragment, yes.
like the sound of it actually is this kind of the, you can piece into this little thing in and of itself without any relationship. So that's really interesting. We do that all the time. We knit pieces of things. So anyway, but you want to, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is perfect because my question was about time.
Oh,
And I think more specifically about the perception and experience of time in research. And I feel like the way you explained your process and research, like, to me, it opened up my chest, because it felt like, you know, you had time and you were very intentional, and you kind of just like let it be. what it
Mm.
required to be. And I feel like the kind of research you're doing requires that understanding of time, that it does take time, and and that's just what it's needed. But I also feel like the world we live in, like there's just such a rush and this idea of, you know, like we're running out of time and we have to do it, and this and this. And I just feel like how do you manage that tension of this like time that you know you need to function and do this kind of research versus
Yeah.
time in the real world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And something, yeah, I mean, I'm sure this resonates with Ron and people from the Everyday Design Studio as well. We've talked a lot about how things like conference deadlines don't line up with the seasons that we need to do some of these studies. Like Kai is at the end of summer, and that's just about when we're getting some findings from these multi-species things, right? So it's not, yeah, it's a dissonance. It doesn't resonate with the temporalities you need to do more than human work. But more to your question, I think, yeah, I think finding things like placing stuff in the backyard and doing things that, like I didn't know that would end up in a paper. It was more just like a curiosity that I was like, okay, I want to figure this out and we'll see where it goes. So a little bit opportunistic maybe, and a little bit separate from having like a different way. I wouldn't say I was planning there, right? So I didn't place it there thinking, okay, then I have it there for so many months and then I can write about it. Of course, at the same time, I also live in our society that is run by time. So I think it's about having sort of these parallel things going on, where maybe you have some of your projects that are planned like that, and then some that are just also growing in the backyard, basically. Yeah, same with the herbarium, actually. That was never something that I thought I would necessarily write about. And in many ways, it's just become something I do now, right? But then I was given the opportunity to write about it for a book chapter, which really allowed me to unpack it a lot more. So yeah, I think it's finding some of these things in your everyday life as well.
I see Ron has his hand up.
Hi, Doenja.
Hi.
Ask you a question. Oh, I'll move so you can see it.
I don't know if I can, like, I don't know if I can move.
It just feels weird that you.
I have no idea how to move the
I
camera.
think it's way
people.
easier.
All right, there we go. It's all fine.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to ask, so actually, you're really wonderful to see, of course. And I want to ask you a question about the Knitting Trees project. And I really loved how you kept referring to these trees as unknown trees.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the classification that you kind of inherited from the data, from the system. And of course, one way to look at it is that, well, no, these trees were very much the opposite of unknown. They were known in a way that you were pursuing them, right? I mean, I think that like all of the things, like the way in which you described different ways of describing their location, for example, the tree bark, the intimacy of knowledge was really there. In fact, in many ways, they were not unknown. They were the complete opposite. It was a different way of knowing. And one could extend that to things like data, like, but so that's one thing. But really, my question is, like, if you look at the data in the mapping system, the Amsterdam mapping system, I mean, these are like Cartesian coordinates. So really, it's not just a question of different. On one hand, it's different ways of knowing, but there are different knowledge systems behind them. And I love how your projects kind of unpack the knowledge system of cities, and the knowledge, and how that clashes with knowledge systems of nature, like species and genus and that sort of thing. And neither of these two really served you well, or it's only one, a mere starting point. So, okay, here's my question. So I want to bring that together with you talked about an archive, and you talked about the knitting ones, and I understand these are all sense-making, you're in process, but I kind of wanted to pin you down. Counter archives would kind of create the assumption that you had an alternative system of knowing, or at least an alternative system of collecting. What's worth collecting? How do you collect it? What do you pay attention to? These are knowledge systems. And then the way you ended the discussion, one of the points was on certainty. And I think push toward designing and push toward HCI research. And of course, that's a whole other question, maybe relates back to how this relates to HCI or research through design, is where one is knowing, right? How does one approach the idea of knowing? But I wanted to ask you this question. So in a way, are these different ways of knowing, and where do they bump up against knowledge systems? Is that something you're trying to avoid? Is that something I mean, you might just be intuiting this at this moment, but I'm just curious. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Right.
I want to keep it simple. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, simple. Lots to unpack there though. But yeah, if I can kind of rehash what I think you're getting at is that these archives, this counter archive that we would be creating would exist within the same knowledge system as the city's
Different
data.
knowledge. Yes.
Different knowledge system.
Perhaps.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
It implies that there is a knowledge system behind how you would organize a counter archive.
Right, right, yes.
There's some certainty to it. And I just want to bring back to your last point about certainty.
Yes, okay. So yes, that is part of it, to create sort of an always uncertain, always open archive, which, similar to the herbarium, will probably never be finished. And so that was also one of the reasons why we ended up opening it up. It's also really daunting, which I think comes with that sort of approach of not knowing, that there's, sometimes seem to be no boundaries, and you're like, do I know what I'm doing? And when does this end and such? Maybe also related to the time question. But there is an underlying question that I haven't like fully unpacked or articulated yet, but that I am kind of trying to wrap my head around, which is not dissimilar from how I opened the talk and thinking about these, colonial relations around control and the way that shapes how we create things, infrastructures, but also things like these data sets or archives. And of course, herbariums traditionally have also been used to come from colonial time, have been used to classify plants, to set up trades, to extract things like coffee and chocolate. So there's all these lineages that I would want to counter with an archive. But the reason why I think the counter archive is interesting is because it's kind of coming from within. So in a way, using similar systems to tease out these tensions. But I think, I'm not fully there yet with what the point is that comes out of that. But I think there's also realizing that, I'm part of those systems myself as well. So that's, I think, why I find it interesting to somewhat stay close to them, but also try to open them up and create cracks in some spaces.
Yeah, agreed. So I mean, I think it really comes down to the tensions and contradictions and challenges of notions like decentering, decolonizing, when so entrenched within, and perhaps simply escape.
Yeah. But I am really careful with use, like I am obviously anti-colonial, but I think I'm careful with using the term decolonial or even labeling any of my work like any of that. I think there's some shared concerns in decolonial and more than human, in that it's both trying to provide, indeed, maybe alternatives to human-centered, particular humans-centered. But I think by labeling things as decolonial, you're also perpetuating and claiming that, which is in itself, again, colonial. And I don't think I, as a Dutch person, am in any position to claim something as decolonial or not. Would also require a lot more than a knitted sample to see something as decolonial, right? Yeah.
Thanks. That's really great. That was a lovely response, I think, honestly. Yeah. So did I see a hand? Yes.
Okay, my question is, how do you decide which constituency to include and which constituency you don't engage with? For example, from the tree projects, you chose not to engage with the constituency of the machine or the yarn themselves. So what's the decision making like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of the question is not yet. So that's one of the things that we keep in our project is saying keeping space for the not yet. So we have considered things with the yarn and also like, I mean, should we grow our own flax to create yarn to knit with? Or should we, a PhD student that I'm working with, Ege Kokkel, she's actually looking into dyeing with different materials and dyeing fabrics. We thought about that. Should we dye with some of the materials that we're looking at? It just becomes really, really big if you're trying to include everything, right? So that's why some of it is indeed not yet, and we might go into that direction at some point. And then a lot of it is about staying in spaces of not making a decision until we have to. So really staying with the uncertainty for a long time and kind of sitting with whatever is coming up, if that makes sense. I know Ege and Netta are also in this call, and I do think a lot of this project, it may seem coherent now, but in the process of it, it was very much like, what are we doing? And I think that's important in trying to kind of start understanding what the constituency is, and then start relating things within the constituency in a way that it could form a practice. So I don't know if it is, we were very hesitant to make active choices there, actually. But of course, in the end, you do make some choices. I think the one with how we worked with the bark, for example, it became clear to us that we wanted to prioritize really situated ways of working with the bark. So being closer to the tree in a way so that we could see the constituency that we were working with and have it closer to us. Whereas if we were working with the 3D scanning software, for example, we understood that there were many other more than human actors connected to, for example, the server or the software that we could never fully be in dialogue with. And so that was informing some of our choices there. And then the knitting is actually where we are much more working now that we have figured out a little bit more of the other part of the process. So I think concerns of yarn choices and machine choices will come into play a lot more there. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Does anybody have, I'll not ask this question if somebody else wants to go. So thank, I'm really enjoying your response space. And I started to kind of.
Face?
You're responding, and you know that there's a quite a lot going on in reflection, like almost undoing what could be an outcome purposefully, and those kinds of notions. And then I started thinking, oh, well, that's interesting. So I guess maybe I want to ask you, in this work, and you're working with others, and clearly you have a reflective shared space practice, a lot of I don't know if experimenting is the right word. It doesn't feel like it would be, but so you have some papers in Kai. So that's a kind of a knowledge, a place where knowledge can be shared. So I guess what are some of the other ways? I'm just, because I know there seems to be this care about like not naming, well, planting. I didn't, but like utilizing prior knowledge structures, and while you're undoing them, creating and practicing. So have you, what are some of the inklings of, okay, outside of the fact that you have published papers, what is shareable? Like
Which
what?
surprises me too sometimes.
It's okay. I mean, it's part of, like, you know, I'm not saying it's wrong or anything. I mean, I'm just kind of curious because there is the part of the destabilization is destabilizing this outcome notion, like the notion of outcome, temporally, but then also like alternate. I don't even know if I want to use the word alternate forms. No matter what word you pick, it just seems like, you know, you're borrowing from, you know, it's from prior states of what we consider knowledge. So I guess I'm curious about are there practices you're using, events, what getting together with the trees? I don't really, you know, I just like I'm curious about, like, because it seems like even in the I really love the herbarium work because it was so it's just like the whole thing felt destabilizing. It's like a wondering, it was like curiosity, it was like almost an innocence in some ways, and at the same time as, you know, and then the ants, they're just like they're these, but there is a kind of the noticing is kind of this place that draws you to the things that you're doing. So I guess I'm curious about, do you have anything you can say about what these outcomes might be? And I don't want to use the word outcomes. I just, anybody give me another word for
Like, I think if we use like the Annising word, like you're leaving traces,
yeah.
right, of these encounters in some way, right?
And I think, I guess I'm thinking too, like, I would love to, you know, be in Amsterdam and be destable. I like have the option of actually being in that space somehow in the traces of what you're doing, and I wonder what that would look like. And I don't even know what that, if that's a thing, but I was just thinking that would be a direct mechanism by which you could experience this kind of knowledge, and also the like repositioning of your senses, whatever is going on. I'm not going to pick the right words, I can tell. But do you understand my question even? Because maybe I'm not even asking the question right. But I guess I'm thinking about, yeah, what are there senses of what that might look like? I don't mean outside of the Kai paper. I mean, there are other things going on with how the knowledge is coming forward. It's sometimes knowledge is given to you somehow. It's not like you're not making it. It's actually, it's emerging in your, you know, so with that mumble of words, do you have anything? It was a question. Because I see the archive, and these forms are really, I mean, they're beautiful, but they have this kind of sense of, oh yeah, okay, it's a thing, okay, you know, and at the same time it's not, you know, and so, and at the same time it's really alive because you realize, like putting the bark back on the tree, that's, no, we are not going to do that. So
Yeah. Okay. I think I can approach this in a few different ways. I think one is, so yeah, I think, I mean, there are events like going on these walks, or with the Knitting with Unknown Trees project, we're now planning for 2 workshops. One is with knitting students from a fashion school in Amsterdam, and the other is at Dutch Design Week. So that is to kind of open this up to the public. But I think that's maybe too literal of a way to answer your question. I do think it's funny because, yeah, I agree that it seems kind of counter to have some of these things in HCI papers or in Kai papers.
by the way, because there's any starting point that destabilizes, that kind of allows those spaces to open up, and there's no reason why writing can't do that. I'm not critiquing it per se. I just was suddenly really curious about these other Elements,
Yeah,
like,
I also don't think we should underestimate the HCI audience because I think they're more open to this type of writing and yeah, opening um, than I maybe initially thought as well. Because a lot of this there was space for at Kai. I do really love writing this up for that audience as well. I think it resonates with a lot of work that's happening there, and I think there's also a lot of resonance and interesting to see how it's being picked up. Also, again, reminds me of work of Ege, who wrote up something for Altkai about meeting a duck in a park. And one of the one of the critiques there was that it wasn't alternative enough, so that it should be part of the main track rather than of the Altkai track. So I think that really shows it is going to be presented in the Altkai track, by the way. So if you want to read about ducks, then please do look it up. But I think that shows that there is space for this in places like Kai as well. And I think yeah, I just never really second guessed to go there with this type of writing, I guess. So I think we should also take that leap and kind of push the field in that direction.
thank you very much. That's, I mean, I just really, a lovely answer. It's, yeah, I didn't mean it to be a judgment of Kai. Not
No,
really.
I mean, we can also do that. That's
Ducks, yeah.
but yeah.
Thank you. Like for, you know, okay, ducks, says Shannon.
Yes.
We're kind of getting close. We should be, we need to wrap it up actually, because there's a school meeting happening. Happens to be SIAT school meeting happening very soon. And I think there's some people coming in to help me set that up as well. So I do want to say, Doenja, thank you so much for the presentation, for the space of questioning and thinking and reflecting about what those questions are. And thank you for everybody here and everybody in the Zoom room.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, so we hope to see you soon. Yeah.
Yes. Same. Say hi to Vancouver trees from me.
So much.